Welcome to the WWC RDD Standards Training module focused on aggregate and pooled impacts. This module describes how to apply the WWC's 5 RDD standards to those studies that report pooled or aggregate impacts. This module introduces the concepts of aggregate and pooled impacts and how these considerations can affect an RDD study's final rating. After completing this module, you will be able to define examples of aggregate or pooled impacts that may occur in RDDs. You will be able to describe how to apply the WWC's 5 RDD standards when reviewing a regression discontinuity design study that presents aggregate or pooled impacts. So some regression discontinuity design studies may report aggregate or pooled impacts for some combinations of forcing variables, cutoff values, and samples. The WWC defines an aggregate impact as the weighted average of impacts that are calculated separately for every combination of forcing variable, cutoff value, or sample. Pooled impacts, on the other hand, are defined as those where data from each combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample are standardized and grouped into a single data set for which a single impact is then calculated. So if an RDD study does report aggregate or pooled impacts, additional considerations are needed when applying the WWC's 5 RDD standards to those study reviews. So before discussing the additional considerations needed when applying the WWC's 5 RDD standards to studies reporting aggregate or pooled impacts, let's first cover a few general considerations. So first and importantly, the overall rating of an RDD study will be the highest rated impact that's presented in a study, including any pooled or aggregate impacts that may be presented in that study. So this means that authors may improve the rating of a pooled or aggregate impact by excluding combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples that do not meet the WWC RDD standards for reasons that are clearly exogenous to intervention participation. So for instance, in a multi-site study, perhaps one site fails the institutional integrity check for manipulation. That site could then be excluded from the aggregate impact, thereby resulting in a higher rating for the aggregate impact. However, potentially endogenous sample exclusions or sample exclusions potentially influenced by the intervention itself will not improve the rating of an aggregate or pooled impact because the RDD standards will be applied as if those exclusions were not made. So the burden of proof will fall on the authors to demonstrate that any exclusions from the aggregate or pooled impact were made for exogenous reasons. Now, the remainder of this module will describe the additional guidance and considerations needed when applying each of the WWC's 5 RDD standards to those studies that might report aggregate or pooled impacts. So as you recall, the WWC's Integrity Standard, or RDD Standard 1, focuses on the integrity of the forcing variable and includes 3 criteria related to the institutional integrity, statistical integrity, and graphical integrity of the forcing variable. When applying the integrity standard to studies that are reporting aggregate or pooled impacts, for each of these 3 criterion, if the integrity of the forcing variable is not satisfied for any combination of the forcing variable, cutoff, or sample that's used in the aggregate or pooled impact, then this criterion is not satisfied for the aggregate or pooled impact. And for each of these 3 criteria, it is acceptable to exclude cases from the pooled or aggregate impact that do not satisfy these criteria. Next, you'll recall that the WWC's Attrition Standard, or RDD Standard 2, focuses on sample attrition and includes 2 criteria depending on which approach the authors use to calculate attrition. When applying the attrition standard to studies reporting pooled impacts, this standard can be applied directly if overall and differential attrition can be calculated for the pooled sample. Now, when applying the attrition standard to studies reporting aggregate impacts, there are several additional considerations that must be made. So if overall and differential attrition can be calculated as the weighted average across each unique combination of forcing variable, cutoff, or sample, then the attrition standard can be applied directly. Now, this aggregation procedure must use the same weights that were used in impact estimation, and whether attrition is deemed low or high will be assessed using aggregate attrition rates. Now, studies for which attrition cannot be calculated, however, those studies simply cannot meet the attrition standard. And then finally, for both pooled and aggregate impacts, it's important to note that any sample units excluded from the impact for endogenous reasons cannot be excluded from the attrition calculation. So next you'll recall that the WWC's continuity standard, or RDD standard 3, focuses on continuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship. And this standard includes 3 criteria related to baseline equivalence, graphical evidence of continuity, and then third, statistical evidence of continuity. When applying the continuity standard to studies reporting pooled impacts, there are no additional considerations necessary. But when applying the continuity standard to studies reporting aggregate impacts, there are some additional considerations. So first, when assessing criterion A for studies reporting aggregate impacts, baseline equivalence can be established by applying the same aggregation approach for the baseline equivalence calculations as the same approach that was used for the aggregate impact estimation on outcomes. Now, when assessing criterion B, the requirements for graphical evidence of continuity must be applied across all combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, or samples. More specifically, there must not be evidence of a discontinuity larger than twice the standard error of the impact at any value outside of the cutoff, but within the bandwidth of any forcing variable for any sample. So what this means then is that a graphical analysis must be presented for every combination of the forcing variable, cutoff, or sample that's used for those aggregate impacts. Now, when impacts from non-overlapping or disjointed samples are being aggregated, excluding samples from the aggregate impact that do not satisfy this criterion can be considered exogenous. And then finally, when assessing criterion C of the continuity standard for studies reporting aggregate impacts, again, the requirements for statistical evidence of continuity must be applied across all combinations of the forcing variables, cutoffs, or samples used in those aggregate impacts. And again, in those cases where impacts from non-overlapping or disjointed samples are being aggregated, it's acceptable to exclude from the aggregate impact any impacts from samples that do not satisfy this criterion. And again, these exclusions shall be considered exogenous. So you'll also recall that the WWC's RDD Functional Form and Bandwidth Standard, or the RDD Standard 4, includes 6 criteria related to modeling specifications in the study. When applying the Functional Form and Bandwidth Standard to studies reporting pooled impacts, the standard can be applied directly as described in earlier modules in this training. Again, however, there are several additional considerations needed when applying this standard to studies that report aggregate impacts. So, when you're applying criteria A, B, C, E, or F, this standard should be applied to every impact included in the aggregate. Any impacts that are excluded from the aggregate because they don't satisfy these criteria will be treated as attrition. So this could mean then that the attrition reported by the study authors does not necessarily match the attrition that's calculated by the Works Clearinghouse. Reviewers applying this standard to any aggregate impacts should carefully ensure that they have the correct sample size numbers to include in any attrition calculations. And then finally, when applying criterion D of the Functional Form and Bandwidth Standard to those studies reporting aggregate impacts, it is sufficient to apply this standard only to the aggregate impact. So in other words, it's not necessary to apply criterion D to every impact included in the aggregate, although showing robustness for every individual impact is also acceptable. Finally, you'll recall that the 5th RDD standard is specifically for reviewing evidence from fuzzy regression discontinuity design studies and includes 8 criteria when evaluating these specific types of RDDs. So when applying the fuzzy RDD standard to studies reporting pooled impacts, this standard can be applied directly and no additional considerations are needed. However, when applying the fuzzy RDD standard to studies reporting aggregate impacts, this standard must be applied to every impact included in the aggregate. The aggregate impact will receive the lowest rating from all among those impact estimates. So any impacts that are excluded from the aggregate will be treated as attrition, with only two exceptions. And those two exceptions would be when these exclusions may be considered exogenous if there's clear evidence of the violation of the exclusion restriction, or if the forcing variable is not considered a strong predictor of participation in the intervention. This concludes our module that described how to apply the WWC's 5 RDD standards to any regression discontinuity design studies that report aggregate or pooled impacts across multiple combinations of forcing variables, cutoff values, or samples. So the next module in the training series will now focus on applying the WWC's 5 RDD standards to cluster assignment regression discontinuity design studies.